Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our Getting Started with LiveCode webinars. I'll just give it a few minutes for everybody to join the room. And as before, if you've got any questions, just pop them into the chat. Hello, Daniel. Hello, Germany. So there's a few people who've joined, but we'll just give it a few minutes to make sure that everybody has a chance to join us. I hope everybody's well today. The weather here in Edinburgh is lovely. Not super warm, but we've got some sunshine, which is nice. Can't go out and enjoy it at the moment, but it's nice to see the sun. Hello from Colorado. Hello Canada. Oh, I've got people all over. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen now, and then we'll wait for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. I've got LiveCode started up already. So my plan for this week is we had one question that I didn't get to last week. I'm going to follow up on some of the things that we talked about last week and that were in the slides, and then we've got a couple of questions that came in during the week that we'll take a quick look at. But as always, if you've got any questions, do pop them in the chat and I will keep an eye on it as we're chatting. So hopefully everybody I don't know if there's anybody who's new this week, but anybody who was here last week, hopefully you got the link to the video recording and to the slides that were just some of the things that we discussed. The thing that I was going to follow up on was scaling your stack automatically for mobile devices, because there's one thing that's not in the slides that's quite useful that I thought I would show with you. Oh, so Devon's asked slides, ? So I wrote some slides that just cover the things that we did in the video, because sometimes it's a bit easier to look back on a slide or a document than try and find the right bit of the video. I think that Heather had sent them out. If you haven't had them, then either perhaps she's not sent them out yet, or that you're not on the list. So I will follow that up with Heather, make sure that everybody who is sort of registered with these webinars is getting the slides and the video, the recording of the video, which we put up afterwards. Okay, so one of the things we talked about last week was how you can scale your app. Now this came up because when you create a new stack, we've got some default sizes here, but we've only got some iPhone sizes, and we've only got 4, 5, 6 and tablets. So these are a little bit out of date. We need to add some of the more recent phones and some Android devices. Obviously there are an almost infinite number of Android devices, so adding them all here would be a very long list, but these are just some stacks with their default width and height set already, so that you don't have to set them. But that's the only thing that we've done there, is basically we've just created a stack at a particular size. Now, the nice thing is that you can create your stack at any size, and then you can use some of the built-in LiveCode commands, which we discussed last week, the full screen mode, to tell the app how to scale onto whatever device it has been deployed to. So you don't have to worry about that. You just create your stack at whatever size is comfortable for you to work with, then you set the full screen mode, and everything else is done for you. So one of the things that that this means is that if you have in your stack different screens or different cards that are to have different layouts, then this can cause some problems. So I will show you an example. I've got a little stack here, which doesn't actually do anything. It's just got some layout. So the first card is a menu, and the second card is where you would play a video or a sound file. So the idea is that this card would be portrait, and this card would be landscape. Now, of course, if you deploy this to a device, in this case, I'll just show you it on the iOS simulator, which is here, then what happens? Oh, that is the correct the correct version. Let me break it for you. So of course, with the full screen mode set, it'll just resize your stack to whatever the size of this device is. So I'll just show you this again. So screen 1, screen 2. So you can see it has turned around, it has changed the orientation, but then it has scaled into the sort of portrait size. So effectively this stack is still 375 by 667, and it's just been scaled to fit in there, which obviously does not look great. So the way that this works is if I look at the card script for the first card, what I've done here is on pre-open card for the first card, I've set the mobile allowed orientations for this card to portrait and portrait upside down. So I've told it that this card must always be in portrait mode. And similarly for the second card, if we go to card 2, so I'll use the view menu, go next, card script. In this one, when the card is opened on pre-open card, we set the allowed orientations to landscape left and landscape right. So we say that this card should be landscape. And by setting the allowed orientations, when you run it on a mobile device, it will force the app to change orientations to one of the allowed orientations. And this is why it automatically switched. Now, of course, when we're using full screen mode, we don't want to fit 375 by 667 into landscape and then squish it, because that looks like you saw, it doesn't look great. So in that case, what we want to do is in our stack script, on pre-open stack, check to see if the environment is mobile. Then we set our full screen mode. So I'm using exact fit, but use whichever one suits you the best. And what we can actually do is we can actually specify the rect, which is the area of the stack, for the different orientations. So we say mobile set full screen rect for orientations, which is a bit of a mouthful, but does make it clear what it's doing. And what we're saying is if we're in portrait or portrait upside down, then the rect of our stack should be 0, 0, 375, 667. And if you haven't come across the rect property before, it's a rectangle. And this is the left, the top, the right, the bottom. So it goes from 0, 0, which is up here, to 375, 667, which is down here. It's just coordinates. So it's just width and height. So we start at top left, go down to bottom right. So when it's portrait, we want it to be 375 by 667. And when it's landscape, we want it to be 667 by 375. So it's the same size of stack. We're just rotating it when we're in landscape. So we set our full screen mode. We define the rects of the stack for portrait and landscape. And you can have, I mean, I've just put these as lists here, but you can have different rects for all 4 orientations if you need to. And this means that when we deploy to our simulator, when it changes orientation, when it switches cards, it will actually, the rect of the stack will change. So now it'll change orientation, but it will be the correct size. So it will be the landscape size. And when we go back, it will switch automatically back to portrait. So that's a nice way that if you have different orientations on different screens in your app, you can manage that and you can still just use the full screen mode. You can use that built-in scaling. Okay, so Kelly's asked, what if you run this app on an iPad size screen? You've hard-coded the rects in the stack script. So that's just because we're using the full screen mode. So with the full screen mode, the rect is effectively always hard-coded. It is the rect that you created your stack at. So if you weren't doing this, if you weren't using the 2 full screen rects, your app would just remain effectively the same size. It would just be scaled using whatever method you chose in here. So if your stack if your app doesn't actually change orientations, then you don't need to do this, and it will just be at the original size and it will scale as defined here. This just allows us to say what the rect should be. So in this case, the stack's effectively the same size. It's just rotated, and that's because we're using full screen mode. So these only really work with full screen mode. So you would usually, it would be the size that you created your stack at, but it doesn't have to be. These could be different. These could be a sort of an iPad size, an iPad ratio, but it will still scale. So if I put this onto a different simulator or onto a different device, so this is an iPhone 8, but if I deployed this to an iPhone X, for example, which has a different screen size, a different screen resolution, then it would still scale properly and everything would look nice and be correctly scaled. So let me see. So David's asked, can I set one card for portrait and one card for landscape to have two different options? Yes, you can. You can just you can have as many cards as you want. You can have different layouts on them, and you can name them differently if you want to have actually completely different layouts. So on an iPad, you might want to have the menu, and then you might want the player to actually be next to it, because you've got sort of more real estate. So yes, you can have one card for portrait and one card for landscape, and just have it laid out how you would want it on those particular cards. And you can use some of the methods that we've got to detect what orientation the app is in, different things. There's lots of options there. And then Kelly's asked, could you please demo changing this to an iPad? So yes, so what I can do is, in my iOS simulator, I can change the device that I'm looking at. So I will choose, let's do iPad 7th generation. I'll hide this one, and hopefully this will start up fairly quickly. The iOS simulator can be a little slow to start up, but hopefully it won't take too long. And then we can just deploy to that and see what it looks like. While that's happening, I'll show you some of the options in the standalone application settings, which actually we'll look at again later. But in iOS and in Android, so in the mobile applications, there are options for example, choosing the initial orientation if you want your app always to start up in portrait, or if it's an iPad, the supported initial orientation. So you've got lots of options for managing the layout things in your app. And then we've got a question here, is LiveCode compatible on Android devices? If yes, what is the latest compatible Android version for LiveCode? So yes, Android, LiveCode's completely compatible with Android. And we've got some lessons on how to set it up. For iOS and Android development, you do have to install some additional software. So for iOS development, you need to install Xcode. For Android development, you need to install Android Studio. But yes, completely compatible. You can build for any Android or iOS level from LiveCode. Well, the new ones. Some of the old ones are obviously not supported anymore, but in terms of the new ones, then yes, you can build for the latest versions. I am going to talk a bit more about building standalones, as we call them, later in this session. So I'll come back to that. Then. We won't be covering actually installing everything, because that can take a while, but I can point you all to the lessons that we have on getting set up for iOS and Android development. And once you have it set up, it's really easy to use. Just give this a second and see if it starts up soon. If not, we can maybe come back to this later, but there we go. So what I'll do is I will close this window so that we deploy here. And what happens here is when you've got all your additional software set up, what will happen is in the development menu, it will show you the test devices that are available to you. So if I had my phone plugged in, it would also show up here. Equally, if I had Android selected in the standalone settings, or if I had an Android phone plugged in, it would also show up here. But this time I'm going to deploy to the iPad simulator. And once I've got it selected, I can just click on the test button and it will deploy to this simulator. So here, because of the size of the stack and because I chose exact fit, actually I think this might be one of the settings in the standalone application settings. So here I've only got iPod and iPhone selected. If I change this to iPod, iPhone and iPad and then test again, it should look a bit better. So here we are on an iPad and it will still switch around. Now you'll see that things are a bit stretched and they don't look quite right. So that's because the option that I chose in the stat script is not one of the ones that preserves the aspect ratio. So if I change this to letterbox, for example, that's one of the options that will preserve the aspect ratio, and test again. Then it should look a bit better, but it will have some black bars, which will, so you can see here, I've got some black bars here, but now the scaling is correct and nothing is squished. So that's one way that you can do it. If you want to get more into the weeds on this, you can actually, you don't have to use the full screen mode. You can actually write code to lay out all your controls exactly where you want them based on the size of the device that it has been deployed to. Obviously that gives you a lot more control, and you can always use the full screen real estate. Obviously in this case we're losing a bit of the screen real estate here because we're not using it. So you have to weigh up between the ease of using the full screen mode and the sort of the level of control that you get by scripting it all yourself. Okay, so hopefully that was useful for everybody. Now, what else did we have questions about? Oh, so one of the questions that we had, oh, good, I'm glad that helped, Kelly. So one of the questions that we had last week was about sending emails from particularly iOS, but in general, we'll talk about it in LiveCode a bit. So I'm just going to show you in the dictionary some of the options that we have here. So specifically for mobile, so iOS and Android, we have mobile send. To help if I could type better. So mobile compose mail. So the mobile compose mail command, you call mobile compose mail with the subject, recipients, CCs, BCCs, body, and any attachments. And then what this will actually do is this will open up an email in the user's email program. So it will effectively open up the email in Gmail or in the mail app on your device, or whatever you have set up as your default mail option, and it will fill it in with all the options that you give it here, but the user will have to, press send themselves. We can't automatically send it using this option. But on mobile, that's generally that's quite a common way of doing it, is it'll open up in the user's mail program. And in here you can mobile compose mail, mobile compose Unicode mail, mobile compose HTML mail. And if you want to check before you use it, you can use mobile can send mail and that will return true or false to tell you whether a mail can be sent. If you're on desktop, then you can use Rev Mail, which is kind of the equivalent, but it's this is the desktop version, and it's very similar. You just call Rev Mail with the address, CC address, subject, and body, and that again on the desktop that will open it up in the user's default email program and send it on. There are ways that you can automatically send from desktop apps, but they're a lot more complicated. You have to get into SMTP servers, and yes. So if you're using Indy, so anything in the dictionary with the blue icon is Indy and above, and anything with the grey icon is business and above. So if you've got one of the commercial licenses, which I guess most people here will have the Indy version, then you can use the TSNet SMTP methods and functions to actually automatically send the email, but that is quite a bit more work than just using RevMail, which will just pop up the mail with the values that you've given it in the user's mail program, and then let them click send. So hopefully that is helpful. Oh, good, Daniel. That was apparently that was Daniel's year this week, and that was his question from last week. So I hope that helped. So some of the other things that I was going to discuss is, I think somebody through the week asked Heather about building standalones. So that is obviously quite a big part of building a LiveCode app and how you share it. So we're going to have a look at building standalones. So I've made a little app that we'll use here. Sorry, I've just closed my Chrome window so I couldn't see you. Right, so I've made a little app that we'll use as an example. It's a dice roller. I was playing some games with some friends at the weekend and needed to roll some dice. So here's a nice little dice roller app. So you can choose how many sides you want on your dice, and then you can roll and it'll give you a random number up to the maximum of the dice that you have chosen. So we're just going to use this as an example for building a standalone. Now, you will write your app, you'll create it, you'll get it all set up, you'll get it working, and then you want to be able to share it with people. And that might be, you might just email it to people, you might put it in one of the stores, you might put it in the Google Play Store or the Mac Store in order to share it. And obviously when you share it, people won't have LiveCode installed. So we build what is called a standalone. So it's a standalone application. It doesn't need LiveCode to run. And that's the app that you can then sell or share, do whatever you want with for your customers, your clients, whoever it may be. So out of the box, LiveCode allows you to build for Windows, Mac, and Linux on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So you can build for all the desktop platforms from all the desktop platforms. So once you've got your app finished and you're happy with it, to save it as a standalone, the first thing we do is we open up the standalone application settings. And this is where all the settings for your standalone application are. So starting with the general settings, this is just the standalone name, which will be taken from the name of your stack. But if you want to change it in here, you can. And then you can also choose where to build it. So there's a default build folder here, which at the moment is just set to my desktop, but you can choose where you want your standalones to be saved. And then there's a couple of options here: search for required inclusions or select inclusions. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So when you first open the standalone application settings, it will automatically have Mac, Windows, and Linux selected. These are the ones that work out of the box. So in Mac, you can build for 64-bit Windows, you can build for 32-bit Windows or 64-bit Windows. That'll actually build you two separate standalones. And you can build for Linux. And in all these panes, there are a number of settings. So for example, you can select icons for your app. So you just click on choose, and I've got some icons ready. So for Mac, it's for Windows, it's an ICNS file on Mac. And for Windows, it's an .ico file. And other options in here, you've got application icons. So these are for ask and answer dialogues, which I think we actually talked about maybe in week 1. You can give it a name, a document type, a signature, an extension, version numbers. All these things are editable. Standalone application settings it'll do its best to fill them in sensibly for you based on the settings of your actual stack, but you can always change them. Similarly for Windows, you choose which platforms you want to build for. You can choose icons, file versions, things like this. There's less options for Linux, but again, 32 or 64-bit and some extra inclusions. So when you've made all your selections, all you do is you do File, Save a standalone application. It'll ask you where you want to build to. So I'm building to the desktop. It should be relatively fast because this is quite a small stack. The bigger your stack is, the longer it will take. And this has created a folder for me down here, Dice Roller 1, and that's just, this is the folder that actually has my stack and everything in it. So if we open this up now, you will see, hopefully, I don't know if this is super clear, but we've got a Linux, a Mac OS, and a Windows folder. And that's because I had, those are the options that I had selected. So I'm on Mac, so I'm going to test the Mac one. So I'm just going to hide my live code so that we can see what's happening. So here's my dice roller.app because this is a standalone. It's got the icon that I selected. Open it up and it'll run just like it did in LiveCode, but obviously no LiveCode necessary. And now this is an app file, so you can share this with people directly. You can build it into an installer. You can sign it and put it in the Mac App Store if you want to. All these options now with your standalone. Similarly, there is a Windows standalone, which is .exe, and a Linux standalone. I can't open those up, obviously, but you could share those with people on Windows or Linux. So now coming back to LiveCode, let's have a quick look at the options for iOS and Android. Now, as I said before, these you need to do a bit more setup for iOS. So iOS, you have to install Xcode. Android, you need Android Studio. This is just because these provide all the extra sort of programs and files that you need to actually build these into standalones. But for iOS, you've got your basic settings, similarly, versions, display names, the internal app ID and profiler for signing your apps when you're ready to put them in test flight for testing or put them in the App Store. They need to be signed. Some other options here, more requirements. So if you want to use local authorized, if you want to use location, if you want to use push notifications, etc., you select these all here. Then you've got icons. So when you're actually building your app for iOS, you need to include a selection of icons of different sizes. So I've got some iOS icons set up here. So you just choose, these are for all the different, these are all the different devices. They have different requirements for different sizes. If you hover over the buttons here, it'll tell you what size they need to be. And then you can also add some splash screens. So this is the screen that shows up while your app is sort of starting up. So you can see a nice screen with your icon or whatever on it before the app actually fully starts. And again, these are different sizes for different devices. You can hover over them to see what size they are. And if you're going to actually get to the point of putting your app into the App Store, then these will be required. But when you're just testing, you don't need them. Similarly, for Android, you can choose which Android devices to build for. So it's ARM or x86, depending on your different Android devices. The nice thing about this is if you select them, whichever ones you select, you'll still just get one Android bundle. So you don't need to build separate standalones for these different versions of Android. You just select all the ones that your app will be supported on, and it's just one app file that when somebody downloads it or via the Play Store, that will take care of all that for you and make sure that they're using the right version. You don't need to worry about it. You just include all the ones that your app might need. Again, there's the name of your app. Again, your identifier, which would be com dot whatever your company or your name is, and then the name of the app. Versions, icons, splash screens. Again, signing. If you're going to put your app into the Google Play Store, you'll need to sign it with a key. Some application permissions. If you need the internet or the camera, you select those here. And similarly, just do File, Save a Standalone Application, and it will build you an iOS or an Android version of your app. So that's it really. Once you're ready to share it, go into the standalone application settings, choose the platforms you want to build for, then File, Save a Standalone Application, and it'll create those apps that you can share in the right format for the different platforms. Now, one thing that I did mention that I was going to come back to is in the general pane, you can search for required inclusions or you can select inclusions. So there are certain libraries, widgets, extensions that LiveCode has. So all the widgets are extensions. There's other ones that you can download. There's libraries. There's sort of supporting externals, things like that. Now, LiveCode's pretty good at sort of scanning your stack and finding all the things that need to be included. So you can usually leave it on search for required inclusions. But if you ever run into any issues, for example, one of your widgets isn't showing up, or a library that you're using is not working when you build a standalone, then your option is to select inclusions for the standalone application. You can then go to the inclusions pane, and here you can actually manually select all the inclusions that you want your app to have access to. So for example, we would want this SVG icon because that's what this is here. There are some libraries that you might want to use, the JSON library, for example, the OAuth 2 library. If you're using them, then you can also choose to manually select them to make sure that all the ones you need are actually selected. Most of the time, you can leave it on telling LiveCode to select them for you. Just if you run into any problems ever and you think something's not being included, then you can choose to do it manually. But for now, I would always leave it on this unless you run into any issues. Okay, so let's just have a look at any questions that we've got here. So Lemuel's asked, when building an application in Android, is the file extension APK? Yes, it will be an APK, and yes, you can install it directly to your Android phone. So there's two ways you can do it. You can actually plug your phone in. So I actually have an Android phone here that I can plug in and show you. So let me just plug this in. It should be charged up. Okay, great. So as long as in my standalone application settings, I have Android selected, then in my test target, then my Android phone will show up, and I can click the test button just like I did with the iOS simulator, and it will deploy it straight to your phone. Alternatively, you can save as a standalone application. So I'll just turn off the desktop ones while we're doing this. Save a standalone application. This time it will build the two mobile platforms, which are the ones that I have selected. Yeah, if you're if you're creating an iOS one, then you need to choose a profile to save it with. So I'll just select my wildcard one, and I'll call that base. So that should work now. This is it's something that you need to do if you're going to do iOS development. Is you need to sign up for an Apple developer account. You need to set up your provisioning profiles, set up app IDs. There's quite a bit of setup to do, but as I said before, we've got some lessons on it. So this should now work, hopefully. Android's a little bit more straightforward, certainly for testing. You don't need to do quite as much setup for Android and testing as you do for iOS, but once you've got it set up, it all works quite seamlessly once it's all in place. And we can always help you if you run into problems getting it set up. Okay, so I now have a Dice Roller 2 folder, which only has iOS. Did I turn off that? Did I turn off Android? Maybe if I sign for development only. Let me just check my LiveCode preferences. Actually, this is where you do your setup. So you can see here, I've got Xcode selected, and this is green, which means everything's fine. And I've got my Android SDK set up, so that should save for me. Try that again. I see. I've actually got a Dice Roller 3 up there. That's probably got the Android one in it. But we'll let this run again anyway. Okay, so Dice Roller 4 now has iOS and Android. So iOS is a .app and Android is a .apk. Now that you've built this, you can actually sort of manually copy this over to your phone, which you have, if you've got it plugged in, you can just copy it over using the file system. But it's actually, if you've got a phone plugged in, it is actually easier just to select it in the test target and then click test. But yes, once you've built the APK, you can copy it over to your folder, copy it over to your phone. You can share it with people and they can put it on their phones. Yes, hopefully that answers your questions. So Devon's asked, can I include a series of HTML, CSS and JS libraries and call them locally in a browser widget? So it really depends what you want to do. So in the dictionary for our browser widget, there are, you can call the JavaScript handlers of your, with your, that you have set on the browser. So you can do some JavaScript stuff from within the browser widget. It will depend what your libraries do. But yes, if you've got a library, you can include it, and then you can use the JavaScript handlers to call it from within the library. There's quite a nice sample stack up that one of our customers wrote that is an example of an OCR library running in that way. I'll see if I can locate it, and I'll send that out along with our slides for this session. Because it's a really good example that somebody has got working, so that's a really good starting point. So I'm just writing myself a note here. Okay, so there's another question from Lonnie. It's a bit longer, so I'm just going to read it to myself for a second. So Lonnie's asking about, I think, just sort of general file and folder access. And yes, if you've got, for example, a notes app and you want to store your notes externally in a text file, which is what you would need to do because you can't actually write within the app itself, then yes, as long as you can build the path to the folder, then you can point to any folder. Now, special folder path is really useful for that. A lot of the time you might want to use special folder path documents / my notes app / whatever as your folder, but you can refer to any folder. And then quite a useful thing to be able to do, so I'll just put some code into a button here, is you can check for the existence of folders or files, and you can create folders or files if you need to. So for example, I can, on my SUP, I can check to see if I have a documents folder. So I can say put, there is a, let's just do it, we'll do an answer actually, it's a bit more obvious. Answer, there's a folder, we'll use a special folder path documents. And then we'll check if there's a folder called this as an example. Take those spaces out just in case. This is an example. So now if I want to run mode and click this, it'll say false because there is not a folder in my documents folder called this is an example. So what I can say is I can check, so I can say if there is not folder, special folder path documents / this is an example, then I can actually create that folder. I can just say create folder, and then do the same thing here. And then when that's done, I can check if there is now a folder. So I can just say answer there is a folder, and that will give me true or false again. So I'm checking to see if that folder exists. If it does not exist, then I will create it. And then afterwards, I will check to see if it now exists. So let's put a breakpoint here so we can see what's happening. There is not a folder, so let's create the folder. Now we'll answer if there is a folder, and now there is. So basically, if you have a particular folder that you want to store data in for your app, when it starts up, you can check to see if the folder exists already. If it does not exist, you can create it. And then the next time you start up your app, that folder should still exist. You can do a similar thing for files. You can say if there is a file and then the path to the file, and that'll tell you if it exists or not, and you can create the file. There's a couple of ways that you can create files in LiveCode. The easiest way is just to put something into it. So if I wanted to create a file here that doesn't exist, I can say put hello into file. And then it's a URL, because it's a file URL. It starts with file colon. And then the path would be special folder path. This is an example / example test.txt. And running that would actually create a text file in that folder that just has the word hello in it. So you can create a file just by putting something into it, and that will automatically create the file for you. So I'm just going to have a look back at that question and see if it seems like I've covered it. So yeah, I think that should hopefully answer your question, Lonnie. The only other thing that you might find useful is if you want the user to be able to actually select a folder to store something in. And what you can say is we've looked in the previous sessions at the answer command, which lets you pop up a dialog. There is actually also an ask command, which allows the user to type in an answer. So for example, I could say ask is your name. This is my button, so I'm just going to click the button again. And so ask will let me type something in there, and then you can store that answer and do something with it. Equally, you can answer and ask for folders. So if you want the user to choose a folder, then you can say answer folder, and then choose a folder, whatever you want to show up on the dialog. And this will give you a folder selector. So then you select a folder, and you choose it, and then you can store that folder. Similarly, you can answer file, choose a text file. And that will ask you to actually choose a file. So the answer and ask, as well as just popping up dialogues, you can ask the user to choose folders, choose files. So if you want them to be able to sort of customize the folder that their data is stored in, then you can use answer folder to have them choose a folder on their system to be used as the storage location. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. I'm just going to have a quick look at them. So David asked, what is the logical and versus the concatenation usage of the ampersand symbol in LiveCode that would allow me to detect whether there are two folders or two files in existence? So and, the logical and, AND, is just the logical operator and. So you can say if case 1 and case 2, then do something. So it's just logical and. We've got logical or and or the other ones I can't remember. But yes, that's just a logical and. So in this case, both case 1 and case 2 would have to be true before you got inside your loop. The ampersand is just string concatenation. So you wouldn't use it with an if, but if you put A and B, or if I answer that. So put things in the message box, but it's a bit easier to see if you answer. So that just gives me AB. So for logical operations, it's the word AND. For string concatenation, that's the ampersand. So if you were trying to detect if there were two folders or two files, then you would use the logical and. So you would say if there is a folder 1, and there is a folder 2, and do whatever you want to do. So yeah, that's how you would do that with the and. Equally, like I say, there's or, there are the other logical operators that I can't remember, but if we look up and, we should get some linked, yeah, so related ones. We've got bit and, we've got not, we've got or. You can see that there. If I scroll down, all the related operators, bit and, not, or. So those are the logical operators in LiveCode. And then let's have a look. So, oh, Linda, I'm sorry you missed the start, but you're here for the last 15 minutes, and like Heather will put the video up on YouTube again. And if you've got any questions, you can always post them under the video, or you can send them to us at LiveCode and we'll try to get to them. Oh yes, and Kelly's pointed out that, about sandboxing. So that's a really good point, actually. If you are making an app, so if it's going to be a mobile app, so iOS or Android really, but mostly iOS, they're very strict, excuse me, then there's only certain places that you can write to. Special folder path documents is the documents folder for the app itself, and you can always write to that on mobile devices on iOS and Android. And if you're storing preferences or user details or lists or anything like that, you would almost always put it in special folder path documents, because that is always accessible to the app, and only to the app. It wouldn't be accessible to any other apps on the phone. The other ones that are useful are special folder path resources, which is where you would find any items you had included. This is something I missed showing you earlier. So in the standalone application settings, there's a copy files pane, and this is where you would copy in any files that need to be included with your app. So this might be video files, sound files, image files. It might be a database or text files that are used by your app to run. So anything that you put into this copy files pane, that's accessible by special folder path resources, but you can't write to those. So if something needs to be writable, it should go into documents. If it's included and you just need to be able to read it and access it, you can use special folder path resources, and that'll give you access to all the files that are included when you build your app. If I have a look at special folder path in the dictionary, you will see that if I scroll down, there is a note here about how iOS systems work. So it only creates files in the documents, cache, and temporary folders. So the document, anything you put in documents will still be there the next time the app is started up. That's not necessarily true for the temporary folders. So anything that doesn't need to last between uses doesn't matter so much. Anything that you want to still be there the next time you use the app, use documents. So there's lists in here for the special folder path on different systems. So there's iOS, there's Android. I think I scrolled a bit too far there. So again, documents, cache, temporary, resources. So there are, especially on mobile devices, that are only particular places that you can actually access and write to. So hopefully that is useful. So just be careful where you're writing to, especially on mobile devices. And then, oh, David has asked just about my example. If there's a folder, or there is a folder, folder 2, that's the correct syntax for LiveCode. You can't say if there is a folder 1 and a folder 2 or similar like that. That's not correct syntax. Because you're kind of, if I put brackets around, it makes it a bit clearer. So that will be true or false. That will be true or false. So it has to be the full syntax in each case. So it's a bit cumbersome, but with the brackets it's a bit clearer. It has to be sort of a full statement every time that you use it. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me have a quick look, see if there's any other questions, and was there anything else that I wanted to cover with you? That was all the stuff I had planned, and we've got about 10 minutes left, so if anybody does have any questions, then do pop them into the chat. I'm just going to scroll down and check that I didn't miss anything while we were chatting away. Yes, I don't think I've missed anything. So yeah, if you've got any questions for the last 10 minutes, then pop them in here. Otherwise, what I'll do is I'll maybe show you where the lessons are for iOS and Android setup. So let me just bring this over. So this is our lessons portal. And I think it's in getting started with LiveCode development, but you can always search for it. Okay, so one quick question that we'll look at first is, sounds like Lonnie's been working his way through our app building course. And he's asked about finding the SQLite button in the standalone application settings. And I think what has happened is it has moved since we did the screenshots and everything for those lessons. So it used to be in here. I'm just going to check that it's not in here anymore. I'm pretty sure it's not. What it actually is now is it's one of the inclusions. So if I scroll down here, I should be able to find SQLite. So here's the SQLite sort of database library. So you just either include it here manually, or hopefully, if you're using it and you leave it on search for required inclusions when saving the standalone application, LiveCode should work out that you need it and it should include it for you. If it's not being included, then like I said before, you can manually include it. And, oh, sorry, I ticked the wrong one. It was SQLite that you were interested in there. So just make sure it's ticked in the inclusions pane. Yeah, so David asked about getting started with code signing. So that's what I was gonna have a look at here. So this, we sort of cover the code signing in these lessons. I'll show you where to get started with these things. And Daniel's asked about the integration of Google Pay and Apple Pay, and we do have support for in-app purchases. I'll just come back to LiveCode quickly. And, oh, not test, dictionary. So in the dictionary, again, we've got a lesson on this as well, but if you search for in-app, no, not in-app. Maybe if I search for purchase. Yes, so it's mobile. So for example, mobile can make purchase. So all the commands and functions for allowing in-app purchases are in the dictionary. If you search for purchase, they'll come up, and I'll point you to a lesson on this as well. But there is support for both iOS and Android and in-app purchases. Okay, so here is our lessons portal, getting started with LiveCode development. Nope, that's the wrong section. Sorry about that. It must be in the previous one. Get up and running with LiveCode. So in here we've got a section on iOS prerequisites and Android prerequisites. So how do I become an iOS developer? So that goes through how you sign up for a developer account, etc. How to build an iOS application, LiveCode and Android Studio. That tells you how to install Android Studio, what packages you need to include for LiveCode to work, and how you connect them up together. And if we have a look at how do I become an iOS developer, You'll see that it is more than a few steps to do this, but once you have it sussed, it's basically configure LiveCode, standalone application settings. You have to have Xcode installed. So yeah, join the iOS developer program, download and install the iOS SDK, configure LiveCode, standalone application settings, etc. And then once you've got that done, the next step is to do the provisioning profiles. So development provisioning profiles allow you to test on devices, and distribution profiles allow you to send things off to the App Store. And we've got a couple of lessons here on how to set them up. One thing that I'll just point out now, in case anybody doesn't know this, is that to do iOS development, you need to be on a Mac. And that's because you need Xcode, and Xcode's only available for the Mac. So unfortunately, there's no way to build iOS apps from a Windows machine. Android works on both iOS and, Android works on Mac and Windows. So here we have lessons on how do I create a development profile for iOS, how do I create a distribution profile for iOS, but the first step is actually to set up your developer account and to make sure that you've got Xcode and anything else that you need installed. Similarly for Android, the first thing to do is to make sure you've got Android Studio installed and connected up to LiveCode, and then you can sign. We've also got a lesson on signing your Android apps. I think it's a self-sign certificate. That's our lesson on that. And I think since we did this lesson, actually, you can do it via the Google Play Store as well. You could just upload your app and it will create upload signing key for you. So yeah, so here we've got how to create a self-signed certificate for an Android app. So that's once you're ready to actually sign your app and do something with it. Up to that point, when you're just testing, you won't need those. You won't need those yet. For iOS, if you're going to test on actual devices, you will need to set up a development provisioning profile. But for testing on the simulator, you don't need that for those first steps. And then David's asked, if I want to build a Mac OS desktop app and distribute it directly to users, can I still sign my app? Yes, you can sign your app. We actually have a lesson on signing apps for distribution outside of the Mac App Store, and for signing it for distribution in the Mac App Store. So I actually recently did this. We have a typing tutor called 10 Thumbs, which I recently, we had to update for Catalina, and one of the steps was signing it. So yes, you can do that. Let's see. So here we have code signing and notarizing your LC standalone for distribution outside the Mac App Store, which that's exactly what it shows you how to do. So yes, you can use the tools on your Mac to sign for distribution outside the Mac App Store, and then it'll run on Catalina without any warnings or any problems for people to run it. So yes, that's doable. And Lonnie's asked, is there any way to do iOS for a Windows computer? And there's not really. Xcode's not available for Windows. There are some services like Mac in Cloud, other services that you can use if you're on a Windows machine, or you can use sort of virtual machine or Parallels, but you need to be able to install Xcode. And then Lonnie's also asked about running apps on LC server. Where do you save them and how do you call them? And I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. You can run LC apps on your LiveCode server. You just upload them to your server, and then they're accessible via a URL. That's how you would run them from the server. If you've got more questions about that, then do contact us about them. But if you've got a LiveCode server account and you've got a server, you can just upload your apps to the server and run them from there. Okay, so we are nearly done for today. If there are any last minute questions, then just pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I think you can always put questions under the video when it's uploaded, and as I've done for the other sessions, I'll write some slides about what we've covered and send them out to you so you've got them to look back on afterwards as well. And what I'll do is in the slides, I'll include links to these main lessons on how to set up for iOS and Android development. It is quite time consuming, so I'm not sure we can cover it in one of these sessions, but we do have good documentation. You can always contact us if you get stuck at any particular points. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful for everybody, and I hope you all have a great week. Okay, thanks for joining me, everybody. Just gonna sign off now. And I will say goodnight, and thanks again.